Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as Alexion is happy to connect with you to share a little bit of information about our company and specifically our NMO program. I wanted to let everyone know that this session is being recorded and will be posted by Guthy-Jackson Charitable Foundation on their website in the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much to Guthy-Jackson for giving us this opportunity to meet with all of you today. As you can see on the screen, our story at Alexion is really rooted in being committed to patients. We currently have medicines indicated to treat 6 different devastating rare diseases with 4 approved therapies. For over 20 years, we have had leadership in complement biology, and you'll learn a little bit more about the complement system and how our medicine works this evening. We have 13 pipeline programs, and we have 7 years as one of Forbes' most innovative companies. Most importantly, we are very committed to serving patients and currently do so across 50 countries. Tonight, our webcast is going to be led by Marcus Youngs. He's the medical director at Alexion. At the conclusion of this session, we will host a Q&A session. Questions may be submitted via the chat feature in the webcast and will be answered in the order received based on time allowed. We will follow up with any additional questions with responses that can also be shared by the Guthy-Jackson Charitable Foundation. Thank you very much.
Sure. So thanks, Wendy, and thanks to everyone else who's listening in today. So as Wendy mentioned, my name is Dr. Marcus Youngs, and I'm a neurologist here at Alexion and a medical director here working on the NMO clinical trials. And as you saw, Wendy just told you a bit about Alexion, and we're going to spend the rest of the webinar talking about Soliris, also known as eculizumab, and how it's used in the treatment of adults with NMO who are anti-aquaporin 4 antibody positive. And we'll talk more about this. And then we're going to end with some additional discussion about our commitment to the community, and then, as Wendy mentioned, a question and answer session. So I just want to start by pointing out that the development of Soliris, which, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking more about throughout the webinar, really relied on a partnership with the NMO community of researchers and patients. And in this case, Soliris actually first became available, as Wendy mentioned, in 2007 to treat another disease. And around the same time, a group of researchers started to realize that based on how Soliris works, it might actually help NMO patients as well. And so this led to more NMO researchers doing a small, what we call proof of concept trial in 14 patients. Afterwards, that was actually started in 2009 and ran for several years. And after that, Alexion then took the information from that and actually started a much larger global clinical trial called the PREVENT trial. And again, we'll be talking about that in detail. But as you can see, that trial actually ran for more than 3 years and actually finished last year. And based on the results from that trial, which we'll talk about, the FDA then evaluated throughout the year this year, and in June of this year, approved Soliris to be used in patients.
And during this whole time, Alexion has been partnering with the Guthy-Jackson Foundation and patients in the community as we've advanced the program for Soliris in NMO.
And so it's important, as you can see, and as Wendy pointed out, that the road from an idea to a medication being available to patients is often a very long one, and one that really does rely on the efforts of many people in the community. And this is a good example of that needing to happen in order for a new medication to become available. So as I already mentioned, we're going to be talking about Soliris today, and I just wanted to very briefly introduce it before we talk more about the specifics. So Soliris, also known as eculizumab, is a prescription medication that is in a class of medications called monoclonal antibodies. And that does mean a number of things, but one of them is that these medications are typically given either by IV or by injection. So in this case, this is an IV infusion, as opposed to some of the more traditional pill-type medications that you may be familiar with. And Soliris itself acts as what's called a complement inhibitor. And what that means is that it inhibits or turns off a part of the immune system called the complement system. And that's how it works, and that's how we think it is helping patients with NMOSD. So in order to sort of explain a little more about that, I want to discuss the complement system in more detail. And we're not going to go into the deep specifics of this, but it is important to understand a little bit about this part of our immune system in order to understand Soliris and NMOSD. And as you can see here, the complement system is a very important part of our immune system, and it helps our body to fight off infection. It helps to protect the body against infection. And the complement system is actually very complicated. It's, as you can see, made up of more than 30 different proteins. And most of these proteins are actually usually just floating around inactive in the body until they're triggered to activate by something such as a bacteria or another foreign invader, so to speak. And when that happens, when a bacteria activates this complement system, it really turns on a large process that allows the body to eventually clear out this foreign invader or destroy the bacteria, for example. And complement really does this in two ways. First, it tells other parts of your immune system to come help it out. And what that really does is it increases inflammation in the area, and that helps the body to fight the infection. And the second thing that the complement system can do is actually directly attack these foreign invaders. And so when this system is working well, it's actually very good at helping us to avoid infection on a day-to-day basis. The problem is that complement can sometimes become activated inappropriately when there isn't a foreign invader to deal with, for example. And this can happen in some diseases called autoimmune diseases. And in these diseases, the immune system mistakes normal tissue for one of these foreign invaders, and it attacks it as if there were an infection that needed to be cleared out. And this can, in many cases, result in damage to the normal tissues, and it's this damage that causes symptoms in the people with these diseases. So this is all important for us to know, and we're talking about it today because anti-aquaporin 4 antibody positive NMOSD, sometimes called seropositive NMOSD, is one of these autoimmune diseases. And in this case, the body is making an abnormal antibody called the AQP4 antibody, or aquaporin 4 antibody. And this antibody mistakes a protein called the aquaporin 4 protein as foreign, even though it's not. This protein is actually found throughout the body in everyone, but predominantly it's found in the brain and in the spinal cord. And this is the reason that patients with NMOSD mostly have symptoms that come from problems in the brain or in the spine. This also includes the nerves that run out to the eyes, which is why many patients with NMOSD have problems with vision and eyesight. So in NMOSD, the abnormal antibody attaches to this protein, this aquaporin 4 protein, and this activates the complement system that we just talked about. And as I said, it gets activated mostly in the brain and in the spine. And once it's active, as we just discussed, complement does what complement does, which means it increases the inflammation in the area, and it also directly can attack these cells in the brain or in the spinal cord. And this injury, this attack, is what causes the symptoms of NMOSD relapse or NMOSD attack. So this is where Soliris comes in as a potential treatment. So Soliris, as I mentioned, is a medication called a monoclonal antibody, and what it does is it attaches to one of those 30 plus complement proteins that we talked about. This one happens to be called C5. And by attaching to this protein, it essentially turns off and deactivates the complement system at that point. And since the complement system is then deactivated, it's less able to cause inflammation or injury, and theoretically this can prevent the symptoms of NMOSD relapse. So this was the theory, and of course theories have to then be tested in real-world clinical trials. And this is why we started the PREVENT trial in 2015. So I'm going to be talking a bit now about the PREVENT trial, and as you may recall from earlier in the webinar, this trial was started in roughly 2014 and ran through 2018. So it lasted more than 3 years, and the trial was designed to test Soliris in patients with NMOSD. And as you can see, ultimately 143 patients, all adults, were enrolled into the trial, and all of these patients had anti-aquaporin 4 antibody positive NMOSD or seropositive NMOSD. And as you can see there, this was what's called a placebo-controlled trial. So in this case, 2/3 of the patients, or 96, were put on Soliris, and 47 were put on placebo. And this was a blinded trial, and what that means is that neither the patients nor their doctors knew whether they were getting medication or whether they were getting placebo. And this is really the best way to truly assess the potential benefit of a medication. So also in this trial, as many of you may know, there are medications currently used by patients on an off-label basis to prevent relapses. And with some exceptions, patients in this trial were allowed to continue using those medications in the background with either the Soliris or the placebo infusion being given on top of their background medications. And the goal of this study was then to determine whether patients who were taking Soliris would take longer before they had a relapse compared with patients on placebo. And in this trial, all of the relapses were actually evaluated by a central independent committee of NMO-SD experts. And as I mentioned, the trial lasted for more than 3 years, so many of these patients were in the trial for quite some time. And at the end of all this, the study goal was actually achieved. And what that means is that patients who were receiving Soliris took longer before they experienced a relapse than the patients who were put on placebo. And as you can see here on the presentation, in putting this in numbers, there was actually a 94% reduction in the risk of relapse for patients who were taking Soliris compared with patients who were taking placebo. And we can look at this in a number of different ways, and I think all of these are important for patients to be aware of. So we also can look at patients after being on treatment for 1 year. And in that case, after 1 year, 98% of the patients who were receiving Soliris were relapse-free, which means they had not had a relapse. And versus 63% of the patients who were getting placebo. And then we actually can look all the way up to 3 years because, as I mentioned, the trial went on for that long. And in that case, at the 3-year time point, 96% of patients on Soliris were relapse-free, again, meaning they had not had a relapse versus 45% of the patients on placebo. So sort of the conclusion there, as you can see, is that patients who were on Soliris had relapses less frequently than patients who were on placebo. And then as you can, if you're looking at the screen, you can see over on the right side that we have the actual numbers there as well. And so as opposed to percentages, you can see here that of the 96 patients who were put on Soliris, 3 of those patients had a relapse as judged by the Central Committee of NMO experts. versus in the placebo group, there were 47 patients, and 21 of those had a relapse over a 3-year period, as noted here. So those are just the actual numbers as opposed to looking at this in percentage form. So based on all of these numbers, it was judged that Soliris is effective at preventing relapses in patients with NMO who are seropositive for the aquaporin 4 antibody. So as you can see here, we of course study medications to determine whether they're effective, but we're also studying medications to make sure that they're safe. And in this case, you can see that the most common side effects that were seen in patients in this trial who were taking Soliris include upper respiratory tract infection, which is also sometimes referred to as the common cold, pain or swelling in the nose or throat, diarrhea, back pain, dizziness, as you can see next, flu-like symptoms, and particularly in this case, headache is a common side effect. And then we have joint pain, and finally bruising. And in general, these were the most common side effects, but patients in general tolerated this medication well in the trial. And it's important while we're talking about safety to point out that Soliris has a black box warning. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, a black box warning is something that is given to medications that have potentially serious side effects, so that patients and their doctors can be aware of the risks when they're considering using the medication. And in the case of Soliris, this potential side effect is meningococcal infection. And meningococcal infection is a type of bacterial infection that can be life-threatening if it's not recognized and treated early. And because of this potential risk, all patients who take Soliris are required to get vaccinated against this meningococcal infection at least 2 weeks prior to starting the medication. So if you are going to consider starting Soliris, or your doctor is considering this for you, this is something they will talk with you about, and something that your doctor should help to arrange at least 2 weeks prior to starting the medication. And this brings up one last point about safety, which is that Soliris is only able to be prescribed, only able to be used through what's called a REMS program, which stands for Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy. And what that means is that this is a program that doctors have to be enrolled in before they can prescribe Soliris. This is so that we can confirm that doctors are aware of the benefits and of the risks of this medication if they're going to be prescribing it. And you may note that if your doctor is considering this, they may tell you there is some paperwork that they need to do in order to prescribe Soliris for you, and this may be part of what they're referring to in that situation. So this brings us to the fact that after, as mentioned earlier in the webinar, after evaluating all the benefits of the medicine, as well as the potential side effects that were seen during the trial, the FDA did approve Soliris in June. You can see June 27th of this year for the treatment of patients who are anti-aquaporin 4 antibody positive and are adults. As I mentioned, this study was only done in adults, and that is how the medication then gets approved by the FDA. So since this medicine is now available, I want to spend some time explaining some of the practical matters involved in how this medication may be given. So as I mentioned earlier, the Soliris is given as an IV infusion, which means it's given through an IV that is put in typically to the arm. And the medicine is infused over approximately 35 minutes. Patients are then typically monitored for 1 hour after the infusion, and this is really to ensure that, that you don't have an allergic reaction. And the reason for that is that, like many monoclonal antibodies, which, as I mentioned, is the class of medication that Soliris is a part of, many monoclonal antibodies can cause serious allergic reactions. And we highlight that so that patients can be aware of that and tell the doctor or the nurse right away if they get any concerning symptoms during the infusion. And that's also the reason that we monitor patients after the infusion to make sure that these are not occurring. And then specifically to talk about how Soliris is dosed. So the dosing of Soliris is done in 2 phases. So initially, Soliris is given as a weekly IV infusion for 5 weeks. So that means 1 infusion a week for 5 weeks. And then infusions are switched to every 2 weeks. So 1 infusion every 2 weeks on an ongoing basis. And if your doctor and you decide that this is a medication you may consider, they can more specifically discuss the dosing information with you. And as you can see here, many of these patients get IV infusions either at the doctor's office or at a hospital clinic or an infusion center. However, some patients, based on insurance coverage, may have the option to actually get these infusions at home. And this is something that some patients prefer and others do not, but it's important to point out that it may be an option depending on your particular situation. And so based on that, I'm going to turn it back over to Wendy to talk a bit about our patient support program and how that may play a role in helping you to navigate some of the sort of specific practical matters about Soliris.
Thank you, Marcus. We have a program at Alexion called OneSource, and the OneSource team is available to everyone in the community. It's an optional program, completely voluntary, and not tied at all to whether or not patients can go on Soliris treatment. OneSource is a patient support program designed to provide personalized support, education, and assistance with access to Soliris for patients and caregivers. As I said, enrollment is optional. The way OneSource is designed is when you do enroll, you'll work with a dedicated team of OneSource case managers who have expertise in rare conditions and the healthcare system. So they can help you with things such as insurance navigation, disease education, community connections, and continuity of care. And by continuity of care, we mean if there's a lapse in your insurance or a change in your insurance, or something going on from that perspective, OneSource can help navigate those types of things. Another example is if you are on treatment with Soliris and you intend to travel, OneSource can help arrange infusions in the area where you'll be visiting. So lots of different opportunities for the OneSource case managers to make your experience as easy on you as possible. The Alexion case manager is the primary contact for our OneSource program, and we will provide information for getting in touch with OneSource through Guthy-Jackson. I have a couple of questions that have come in on the chat, so I'm going to read a couple of those and provide some feedback and answers. And I'll start with the first one that has come in from several people. Do you expect private insurance payers to require pre-authorization before Soliris treatment? And what we can say about this is that individual coverage will depend on each person's own health insurance and drug coverage benefits. Currently, many private payers do require pre-authorization for the use of Soliris in other approved indications, and we expect that they will operate in a similar way with NMO. This is another area where OneSource does work with the healthcare providers and their offices to ensure that these prior authorizations get processed as completely and quickly as possible. Because pre-authorization requirements differ from insurer to insurer, Our OneSource case managers are available to help with obtaining further information about specific benefits for specific patients. As I mentioned, we'll provide the contact information to Guthy-Jackson. It's also available on our website, and you can go to alexiononesource.com to learn more about OneSource. A few other questions that have come in. Marcus, I'll hand this one over to you.
Sure.
Now that there is an approved medication for NMOSD, aquaporin 4 positive patients, will doctors be required to try Soliris before they try a medicine like Rituxan or Cellcept that is not approved?
Thanks, Wendy. That's a good question. And really here, I think the important thing to point out is that patients really should consult with their doctors to determine the treatment option that is most appropriate for them. Soliris is the first approved treatment for NMOSD in adults who are aquaporin 4 antibody positive. And as we talked about just a moment ago in the clinical trial, Soliris did meet its primary endpoint of prolonging the time to first relapse and reducing the risk of relapse. So taking all that information, patients should talk with their doctors about their specific situation. It's also important to point out that individual insurance plans may have different reimbursement policies. So it's important that patients discuss all of this with their doctor when they're considering this option.
Thanks, Marcus. Another question we've gotten is, my antibody status has changed. I used to be positive and now I'm negative. What does that mean, and should I get retested?
Great, another great question from the community here. So I think the best thing to say there is that antibody tests measure both the presence of antibodies as well as the number or the amount of those antibodies present in your blood. And these tests are often designed with what's called a threshold or a cutoff concentration of antibodies in the bloodstream that must be reached before the test can be considered to be positive. And since everyone's body produces antibodies at a different rate, some people, especially patients who have compromised immune systems or perhaps a reduced immune response due to medications that they're taking, may produce fewer of these antibodies or produce antibodies at a slower rate than patients who do not have these either compromised immune systems or who are not taking medications that might reduce the immune response. And as a result, this might actually lead to patients receiving a negative test result, and then later, after a number of antibodies in their blood gets higher, could be retested and get a positive result. And the opposite can also occur, that some patients who were positive at one point and again perhaps went on treatment may actually have the amount of antibodies in their blood drop below the level that the test can actually detect them and return a positive result. And this is the reason that some patients who are aquaporin 4 antibody positive can actually later have tests that return negative. And as I mentioned, that can sometimes be the result of certain medications that the patients may be taking. And so given that this is a bit complex and everyone's situation is of course unique, I would say, as we typically do, if you do have questions about your individual results over time, I would bring that back up with your doctor in this context.
Thank you. We have a number of questions. Is Soliris safe to use while trying to get pregnant or being pregnant?
Good, yes, and given that this is a disease that of course affects men and women, but for those of you who know the general, what we call demographics in this disease, it is more common in women, and so this question does come up frequently. And the answer we have, or we give to patients, is that the safety of Soliris in pregnant women with NMOSD has not really been studied. So patients who were pregnant were not able to enroll into the clinical trial. So we haven't actually studied this medication in pregnant patients with NMOSD. However, Soliris is currently used during pregnancy in women with other diseases for which Soliris is indicated. Two of those are hematologic disorders and a renal disorder, one called PNH and one called atypical HUS. These are two of the other conditions that Soliris is currently approved for. So again, given all of this, I would say it's important if you're a patient considering this that you should really talk with your doctor regarding which treatment option is most appropriate for you in your particular situation.
Thank you. A couple others. What symptoms were considered a relapse during the trial? And can you explain adjudicated?
Sure, of course. So those sort of go hand in hand, actually. So symptoms that were considered a relapse really could be any symptom that patients typically get with NMOSD. So I'm sure the people on this webinar or listening to this webinar are more than familiar with these, but as you know, common symptoms might be trouble seeing, blurry vision, or blindness, or trouble with the spinal cord that could result in numbness or weakness, pain, bladder problems, etc. So really any potential symptom attributed to the nervous system that could be related to relapse was evaluated in this trial as a potential relapse. So that then became up to the judgment of your doctor to determine whether, based on all the information they had, including potentially testing such as MRI scans, which all of you are, I'm sure, familiar with, to help them determine whether this could be a relapse. So that's the first part of that. And then the second part is the word adjudicated. And that refers back to the fact that we sort of had a second look at these relapses in this trial. And what that means is that there was a central group of NMOSD experts called an adjudication committee. And their role in this trial was to assess all of these relapses in, again, what we call blinded fashion. And what that means is they got information about the patients in the trial. They got information about the symptoms they were having that were concerning for relapse. They got information about all of their test results and all of the symptoms that their doctor reported, as well as the neurologic exam findings. And then, but the committee did not know which treatment the patient was on. So that's where the blinded component comes in. And then the committee was able to use all of that information to determine whether the symptoms met the criteria for what was considered a relapse in the trial. And that's where the word adjudicated comes from.
We have a couple of others, Marcus. Thank you very much. With dosing for Soliris infusions, is there any pre-treatment or pre-medications required prior to the infusion?
So that's a good question. There are no required pre-treatments. Of course, physicians are free to use pre-treatments if that is their practice pattern or if they feel that is necessary. But in the clinical trial, there was no required pre-treatment for the infusions.
And other than having to be vaccinated prior to
right.
starting.
You're exactly right. So that's the pre-treatment question, I would say, is related to at each infusion, does the patient do some patients with various infusions may take other medications as pre-treatment. But you're right, in this case, that's not necessary. Now, the vaccination is sort of we'll call it a pre-requirement, so that you have to get the vaccine at least 2 weeks prior to starting the first dose of Soliris.
Thank you. We want to thank everybody who participated this evening and called in, and very importantly want to acknowledge and thank all of the people who participated in the clinical trial and in all clinical trials in NMO. The content provided in this webinar was Alexion's. We appreciate Guthy-Jackson supporting this and making it available to all of you, but Guthy-Jackson does not perform clinical trials, nor does it endorse any particular clinical trial design or drug. So the content in the webinar is Alexion's. You can see on the screen here that if you'd like to read the full package insert for Soliris and all of the safety information, you can access that at the link that's provided here. https://alexion.com/documents/Solaris_USPI.pdf. And if you Google Solaris package insert, you will get to the same place. But we are also going to provide this webinar and post the information. And should you have any specific questions, you can reach out to our OneSource team at alexiononesource.com or patientadvocacy@alexion.com. Thank you very much, and we look forward to connecting with all of you again soon. Have a great day.